Camden Lock in North London. I've known this area for getting on for 50 years, since I was Deputy President of the National Union of Students. In that time, I met many people who became lifelong friends, both from the left and from the right. Well, today I'm catching up with one of them who has become a big figure on the political stage here at home, having been an MP not once but twice, and indeed for two different parties. And goodness me, has he got a lot to say on the international stage as well. Ladies and gentlemen, my next guest is George Galloway. George, great to see you.
Very good to see you.
Thank you very much. Sit you down. Sit you down.
Thank you.
George, it's great to see you, and I want to start with what to me seems to be the obvious and biggest question, given all that I know about what makes you tick. Do you believe that the majority of UK citizens will ever vote for full-blooded socialism?
No, but then I think that what we define as full-blooded socialism is beginning to change. A country like China, for example, which has many downsides to it, has managed somehow to synthesize both capitalism and socialism and has produced an economic miracle, which is why some people hate it. So it's a moving feast, if you like. It's a work in progress, what socialism is.
But individual citizens still working their butts off as hard as they can to earn their crust and keep as much of that as they can, and even inventing brand new companies and setting them up, that gets thumbs up from Galloway.
Yes, I'm in favour of that. I'm in favour of small and medium-sized enterprises achieving the maximum support from the state. I believe that the state should control the commanding heights of the economy, not necessarily own them, but command them.
That's a subtle edit of Clause 4 of the Labour Party
yes,
that Blair threw out.
It is subtle. Subtlety is my middle name. And you know, as that great Marxist Groucho said, when the facts change, so do my opinions.
And John Maynard Keynes on the other side. Are you still a parliamentarian as a Democrat?
Yes, and I, if I may say so, I think I was relatively good at it. I achieved awards. Even The Spectator gave me the Parliamentary Debater of the Year award. But I don't think Parliament is the finished article either. I think there are many things wrong with our Parliament, not the least of which is that half of it is unelected and stuffed full of cronies and flatmates and donors. And, you know, when I first went into Parliament 35 years ago now, it was stuffed with the putrefying corpses of the English aristocracy, as I used to say. It's actually got worse. Now it's stuffed with the party donors and cronies and so on. And so Parliament isn't the finished article either. But a directly elected, democratically chosen and removable assembly has to be the way forward for a democratic people like ours.
We've known each other for nearly half a century. You've become a reformist.
Well, in a way. In fact, the far left used to always call me a reformist.
Oh,
because,
really?
Yes, because I was in the Labour Party and never a communist, never a Marxist or a Leninist, still less a Trotskyist. I was never any of those things.
So not a million miles from the likes of Charles Clarke?
No, I would say I'm a Benite. I would say that Mr. Ben, the late Mr. Ben, is the best Prime Minister that we never had, but closely followed by John Smith. So, yes, I'm not for the revolutionary overthrow of the way we are. I'm not for, arresting the royal family or even the plutocrats. I'm in favour of common sense socialism. And I think there's a bigger and bigger market for that.
Why then Respect and now the Workers' Party of Britain? At what point did you give up on Labour and why?
Well, they gave up on me. Tony Blair expelled me from the party in 2003.
Yeah, but Mike Gapes hasn't set up a fresh party or many others.
That's true. But I still believed, number one, that there was life in the perspective of politics that I had, and two, life in me. If you think about it, I was expelled almost 20 years ago, and I'm still going kind of strong now. So 20 years ago, I wasn't ready for retirement, and I still believe that the stance that I took on the Iraq War, which, by the way, is more or less shared by everybody now, even if they won't necessarily admit it in public, was the right one. And I put it to the test in Bethnal Green and Bow in 2005 and had a triumphant victory, one that was repeated in Bradford West in 2012. And I'm still going. The Workers' Party does what it says on the tin. It stands up for the workers above all, the producers of all wealth, and the people who don't have a party now speaking for them, because
Sure.
Labour's
But it was
a caricature.
profoundly wrong in the Gulf War, as you've just quoted John Smith as one of your great heroes, because he echoed it as well at the time when the party expelled you. You don't incite treason, you don't incite rebellion amongst the armed forces of this country when they are on a mission in the Queen's name and in the country's name. That was a major error of judgment on your part.
Except I didn't. That's what they charged me with. But any impartial observer of my stand at the time would deny that. As a matter of fact, I have stood by the troops, for example, opposing their criminalization, putting them on trial and so on. It's the politicians that should be on trial, not the poor infantry.
Well, you've made that crystal clear with Tony Blair, which flows directly from all of those events as well. And you've produced a film, a video, and it has a huge audience for it. It's not going to happen. He's going to get his knighthood. You're not going to put him on trial. Has it not become a dangerous fixation for you now?
No, I'll never forget what was done, any more than people of a previous generation can forget the Second World War and the crimes of fascism and so on. I still remember every day and force my large social media following to follow every day the crimes of the Holocaust, for example. I'm probably the most prodigious retweeter of the Auschwitz Museum's output, which it's vital that people remember, for fear of repeating all these things. So
let me jump ahead to it. That's a crucial point, but you leap ahead to my logic. I was going to come to that in a moment because of your departure from talk radio over allegations of anti-Semitism because of a football club. And you denied it then, as you've just denied it forcefully there. But you do still stand accused in the public mind of being, if not anti-Semitic, profoundly anti-Israel. And an awful lot of Jewish people will say, if you're anti-Israel, you're anti-Judaism.
Well, they're wrong to say that, and any serious examination of the history of this conflict would make that clear. Some of the greatest proponents of Palestinian rights and critics of Israel are themselves Jewish. I had one on my show. Gideon Levy of Haaretz newspaper is possibly the most respected journalist and commentator there's ever been in Israel. And you couldn't slip sixpence between his view and mine. So, no, it's a foolish tabloidization to equate opposition to the crimes of a political state with hatred and loathing of a religion or a national group. After all, I'm also one of the main critics of Saudi Arabia, but nobody would accuse me of hating Muslims.
Let me link that with where we were previously in the conversation, because allegations of anti-Semitism within Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party were profound, and Sir Keir Starmer is still wrestling with the aftermath of them, not least, Mike Gapes is one, and other people that have been through that same road. Do you believe that because of that and because of the Iraq War and the rest of it, the Labour Party is now a lost cause, and that your legacy, or part of your legacy, you'd like to be the end of the Labour Party as we now see it?
I wish it oblivion. I think it's a lost cause, but not for the reasons that you cite, at least not substantially for those reasons. I now trace the decline of the Labour Party, some of your viewers won't like this, to the turn to liberal individualistic identity politics, which began long before Jeremy Corbyn. I sort of sensed it happening at the time. I always say the decline of the Labour Party began when summer schools began to sit in a circle rather than in serried ranks and be talked to by an expert. I remember thinking at the time, well, actually, I'd rather hear the expert.
Someone on the programme recently said, encapsulating that or perhaps knocking it forward slightly, and on economic policy and on competition and on the rest of it, it's become Tory light.
Yes, although even the Tories are Blairites now. I mean, when I hear people say, and I do all the time, this is the most right-wing Tory government we've ever had and so on. First of all, they must be very young, or they must have lost their memory. They mustn't know about Margaret Thatcher and Keith Joseph and Norman Tebbit and the hobnailed boots of the Thatcher era if they really think that Boris Johnson is the most right-wing Prime Minister we've ever had. Boris Johnson is himself a Liberal. I think the Conservatives and the Labour Party are now both essentially Liberal parties. And that leaves a lot of scope for people like Farage and co on the right and people like me on the left.
Do you think when you met with Saddam Hussein in 1994 and famously said, "Sir, I salute your courage, your strength, your indefatigability," that in terms of a serious political player in the United Kingdom, you never recovered?
Well, you wouldn't be here now, 20...
No, well, I would be, because I'm genuinely interested in thoughts. And I speak to people who I've known for a long time who take different views to me, same views as me. But I now look at you, and your first answer, having become a reformist in many senses, I find intriguing. But also I look at you and think, what could have been? And in 1994, in a brilliant, brilliant speech, you left yourself incapable of being repaired.
I was being elected to Parliament many times since then, twice more or less as an independent against the Labour Party. So that wouldn't seem to be a public judgment. It's a journalistic judgment that some have made and some inside the political machine. Yes. But the man who greeted me on the day I returned from Iraq, in the midst of that storm, was the late John Smith, who came into the tea room with his tray of fish and chips and looked around as to where he was going to sit. And he came and sat with me. And sotto voce, he said to me, "Don't trouble yourself about it. It'll all pass." And pass indeed it did. I've never forgotten that. I wrote about it at the time. John Smith was a very great man and a very great loss. And if we hadn't lost him, we never would have had Tony Blair. And therefore, we might not have had the Iraq War. And you might therefore now be speaking to me as a Labour member of Parliament, or, I don't know, perhaps a Labour peer.
Well, I know one thing absolutely for sure: it wouldn't be as a peer, because you simply, like many others before you, you'd have simply said no. There isn't a war between the Ukraine and Russia at the moment, as we speak. If Putin decided that for whatever reason he was going to invade Ukraine, would you support him?
There's absolutely no possibility whatsoever that the Russians will invade.
If you were wrong and the Russians invaded, would you support him?
Not if it was an unprovoked and lying act that he carried out. I would not, no.
You said when the Soviet Union collapsed, and we've talked about this before because I was in Berlin in 1989, which set that ball rolling. You said it broke your heart when the Soviet Union collapsed. I completely understand that. But is Putin an honourable successor to the likes of Marx and Lenin and even Gorbachev?
He's not a communist at all.
He's a crook.
Which is one of
He's a lawbreaker. He's a crook.
Which is one of the reasons why I find this conflict so perplexing. With China, okay, it's an existential threat. It's a different system. But Russia is a white, Christian, capitalist, European country. There seems no reason why it should perpetually be our enemy. Indeed, your own colleague on GBNews, Neil Oliver, has posed that question: why are we so intent upon trouble with Russia? So I don't believe that Putin is a communist or that he's trying to recreate the Soviet Union. But I do believe that the period that was provoked by the collapse of the Soviet Union was the most dangerous period of all. Unipolar power in the world is inherently an extremely dangerous thing. And that brought us the Iraq war that we've spent so much time talking about even now, today.
Do you respect Ukraine's right to desire membership of the European Union and NATO?
The European Union, for sure. NATO would be an act of foolhardiness, almost impossible to exaggerate.
Simply because it sits on the border?
On the border, and in defiance of the promises made by the American President and Secretary of State, James Baker, who wrote about it voluminously in his memoirs. It's a promise that has been comprehensively broken. Now, I blame Gorbachev myself. I would have whipped out a notebook and said, write that down and sign it. But they didn't, although Baker's memoirs make it more clear than anyone could want. So I think joining NATO would be foolhardy. And I see that the Ukrainian ambassador to London on the BBC has said that the Ukraine may very well be prepared to drop its intention to join NATO, and that would be the best solution. It's a common sense solution, you see. Yep. I come back to this phrase, common sense. There are things that are common sense and are above, therefore, ideology. This is one of them.
We both work for organisations, RT UK, which has been criticised in many ways, mouthpiece for Moscow and all of that stuff. I work for GBNews, which has been criticised as a mouthpiece for Richard Tice's party and Farage's operations and what have you. But we both loved what we do. Neither of those organisations could or would have existed when we first met. How do you view, amidst all of the talk of the BBC being in existential decline, the state of UK broadcasting?
Well, I do think this is a revolutionary period, and we're lucky still to be functioning in it. Now, I have almost 2 million followers on social media. I can communicate with them at the touch of a keyboard key. That is a tremendous, revolutionary change that couldn't even have been imagined back then when we first met. So I thank God I'm alive and still talking, still thinking, still agitating, if you like, for the point of view that I have. And it's never going to be turned back.
No. Indeed, when we first met, we were, relatively speaking, young men. And it's mainly young men and women these days and others who say it's the BBC that's let them down. It's turned them off politics. It's turned them off society. It's turned them off democracy. To me, that's a really profound worry.
The first B in the acronym BBC is British. It's my view that over the last near decade now, the British Broadcasting Corporation has lost the British. It actually seems to dislike the prevailing culture, the decisions, democratic decisions of the British people. It has fought a rearguard action, for example, against Brexit. There is a flagrant breach of trust with the people who pay for it. I live in Scotland. BBC Scotland is a flag-waving, banner-carrying, proselytising advocate for the breakup of the very Britain which pays the wages of the people in the British Broadcasting Corporation. And it has slowly, but now picking up momentum, lost all credibility. And I think the era, and I think we'll live long enough to see it, there'll be no more license fee, there'll be no more cosseting of the privileged echelons of the BBC with their unbelievable salaries. And it's nothing to do with envy when I say that. I have more than enough money. It's that the public are forced as a poll tax to pay inflated salaries for inferior product, and the news product oftentimes seems to be bent upon actually demoralising the British people rather than bringing them together.
You mentioned Scotland there, and you are, the clue's in the accent, I've lost mine, but you're profoundly proud of being a Scot, and unusually you are a dyed-in-the-wool unionist, not a conservative and unionist, far from it, but you're a unionist. Do you believe that your side, whether it be Labour, Tory, Liberal or Galloway, have seen off another attempt for Scotland to go independent, or do you think Sturgeon may still one day win the day?
I don't think she'll win the day. I think the Scots are too canny to jump over a cliff, at least without having a proper calculation of the coins involved. The Scots are careful with their money. They know that the leap into the dark of separatism is a very unwise judgment, and they won't make it. But the incipient and I think toxic idea of separatism, which is based upon nationalism, which is based upon exceptionalism and dislike, even perhaps in some cases a hatred. For example, Boris Johnson is in Scotland now. There's people denying that he has the right to be in Scotland. As earlier they did with Farage. I was practically the only person to defend Farage when they tried to run him out of Edinburgh. On BBC Question Time, I resolutely defended him. So dislike of your neighbour is a very demeaning and potentially dangerous thing. And I'm sorry to say that approximately 25% to 30% of our compatriots are in the grip of that kind of mentality. But it'll never reach
penultimate
a majority.
Question. I mentioned Nicola, and you commented upon it. Let's go back to our youth, as it were, and it informs my two final questions. The first is this. We both know Nicola Sturgeon, but we also knew Donald Dewar. We both know Boris Johnson, or certainly know of him, but we also knew Margaret Thatcher. We know Sir Keir Starmer, but we also knew Tony Blair and others before him. How do you rate the current calibre across the spectrum of those that we are blessed to have leading us or seeking to lead us?
I'm glad you asked me that, because I think that if you force me to give one takeaway of how it was then and how it is now, it would be that everyone got smaller. In the case of Donald Dewar and Nicola Sturgeon, actually literally as well as metaphorically, but that's true across the board. When I entered Parliament 35 years ago, there were more than 100, well over 100 men and women of independent mind who, when they rose in the chamber, you actually did not know what they were going to say. Pagers hadn't been invented yet. No one put them on message. They were people that were unpredictable, therefore, in that sense, and possessed of themselves big ideas and big concepts in politics, which all seem to have been frittered away. So was it Greta Garbo who said, "I'm still big, it's the pictures that got small"? That's how I feel. Yeah. I feel I'm still big, but the picture got small. And the death of ideology and the spadization of the political class, by which I mean, you could sit in the tea room in the House of Commons and gaze around you at all the people on the staff of the parliamentarians, watching to see how steadily or unsteadily the MPs were walking, in case there might be a by-election in the offing. This professionalisation of the political class. I mean, I used to sit between Dennis Healy, a beachmaster at Anzio, and Peter Shore, the giant figure in the opposition to joining the EU back in 1973, the man whose liquid gold of 8 minutes at the Oxford Union was the best argument against joining the EU back in 1975's referendum that you'll ever hear. I used to sit between them. Yeah. Substantial figures of historical importance. I gaze across the Parliament now. First of all, I scarcely know who the people are that are speaking. They often resign from jobs I never knew that they had in the first place. And I'm struck by how small the political class got.
Final point, we began talking about China, and you said a lot of things that I genuinely didn't expect. And that's why I dubbed you a reformist, as it were, but in a good way. And I can remember when that revolution took place in China in the late 70s and the market reforms were imposed. There are still huge human rights problems in China. We both agree on that. I know that for a fact, so we don't need to go there. But here's the thing about George Galloway. You have always been of the left, clearly, transparently so, but you supported Brexit. You mentioned Peter there, and we've talked about Tony Benn already. And yet, as a man of the left. You're as against counterculture as some of my most right-wing political friends, many of whom work at GB What the heck are you really?
Well, never confuse me with a liberal. Being a socialist is not the same thing at all as being a liberal. I have never been a liberal. I have always believed that Labour spent too much time worrying about criminals than the victims of criminals. I've always believed in the family. I am the father of 6 children. I'm against drugs. I'm against alcohol. I'm against abortion. I'm against euthanasia, and have spoken and written on these things over many decades. So I am socially conservative and economically radical. And I believe in an independent foreign policy. I believe in a Britain independent, both of the European Union and the United States of America. And I believe in our culture. I believe in our language. I think it's the greatest, most fruitful language and culture that the world has yet seen. I'm schooling my eldest son, 14, right at this minute on Shakespeare. He said to me, I find Shakespeare boring. I said, boring? Bring your books to me and I'll go through it with you. So I believe in our people. I believe in their greatness. I believe in our country, our language, our culture. And some people say that makes me a conservative. I believe it makes me a patriotic socialist, a common sense socialist.
Great to see you.
And you.